Welcome, I'm Gary Seymour, Crown Family Director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. Welcome to the second half of our program celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Crown Center. Yesterday, our program focused on Iran with a keynote address by Suzanne Maloney of the Brookings Institution and a panel discussion moderated by Naghmeh Sorabe, Director of Research at the Crown Center. If you missed yesterday's session, we'll be posting it on our website, so please take a look. Today, we're going to be traveling around the rest of the Middle East with 3 panel discussions. We'll start with a panel on Egypt and North Africa, moderated by Professor Eva Bellin, who is the Myra and Robert Kraft Professor of Arab Politics in the Department of Politics here at Brandeis and the Crown Center. Then we're going to travel east for a panel on the future of Israel, Syria, and the Levant, which will be moderated by Peter Krause, Professor of Political Science at Boston College and formerly a Faculty Leave Fellow at the Crown Center. Then we go east and south and end up with a panel on the future of Turkey, Iraq, and the Gulf, moderated by Killian Clark, a professor of politics at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. The theme of the panels is the future challenges and opportunities in the Middle East. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Eva Bellin to introduce and moderate the first panel. Thank you.
This part of the region is made up of a diverse set of countries, and they face a variety of challenges and opportunities. We are going to focus our attention on 3 countries in particular: Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia. And the experience of these 3 countries highlights some of the most interesting and important challenges faced by the region today. So we're going to start with the case of Egypt, and we're very lucky to have Candace Lukasik as our interlocutor for the Egyptian case. Candace's research focuses on the transnational politics of migration, violence, and indigeneity in the Middle East. And she specifically focuses on Egypt, Iraq, and the U.S. diaspora, the Arab diaspora in the U.S. She has published her first book, Martyrs and Migrants, Coptic Christians and the Persecution Politics of the U.S. Empire. Candace has spent significant time working in Egypt, and she has very strong ties to that country, so we are very pleased to have her here to talk about some issues. So Candace, let's start by reflecting a little bit on what you think are some of the most formidable challenges that Egypt faces today.
Thank you, Eva, for that introduction. So I am an anthropologist, which means I hang out with people. So my comments will touch on some of these broader kind of structural issues that Egypt is facing, both economically and politically, but with an attunement to the fact that everyday Egyptians have been suffering greatly because of severe economic decline and austerity measures, particularly over the past 5 years, but over decades. And so I just wanted to kind of start with that kind of framing to say that the devaluation of the Egyptian pound, both in 2023 and then it's floating in 2024, had a severe impact upon everyday Egyptians, meaning that particularly in 2024, overnight, somebody's salary went from nearly half of what it was, especially if they were being paid only in Egyptian pounds. And so that has impacted family life, that has impacted political life. So just to kind of have that as a broader framing, But more so, Egypt, especially over the past several years, has racked up enormous amounts of foreign debt. Right now it's up to 160 billion because of mega projects, et cetera. And as a result of those kind of IMF loans, there have been conditions put in place that have led to austerity measures that I had mentioned previously, both with regard to food subsidies, energy, and education. Not only because food has become incredibly expensive, especially meat, and which affects like everyday life for Egyptian families. But in particular, education, there has been a severe push to the private sector. And what I mean by that is, for example, my own nephews, each one of them go to private school, private Catholic school, because the Egyptian public school system has severely deteriorated. And because of that, tuition is very expensive for a middle-class family. Imagine a poor Egyptian family being able to support and fund tutors, et cetera, which means that parents are taking on 2 or 3 jobs at a time, and they're not spending time with their children, et cetera. So just to kind of give you like a broad understanding of what Egyptian like social and family life is kind of at the everyday in neighborhoods, et cetera. So this is kind of the social window that I want us to kind of walk into in thinking about the broader political issues that Egypt is facing. And Emmanuel Macron's recent visit to Egypt is framed in this way. Not only was it obviously focused on kind of repositioning Egypt's strategic role in negotiations around Gaza and what a post-war Gaza looks like, but it also was meant to solidify a new form, a new channel of funding and aid for the Egyptian state when they signed a deal for $285 million in grants and loans for things like transportation, energy, water. And there's many very funny like social media, I don't know, clips that came out of like, you know, Sisi and Macron like on the Egyptian metro, et cetera, or in Khana Khalili, like the main marketplace there. And I laugh at that only because, you know, it obviously, Egyptians are very funny people, so they take these very serious conditions and try to make light of them. But that visit obviously comes in light of the shifting role of Egypt vis-a-vis its relationship with the United States and broader alliances in the region. So I don't want to go on for too long, but just to say that the U.S.-Egypt relationship and its kind of differences over Gaza in particular, of course, is like a result of Egypt not wanting Palestinian displacement in general as a cause, but more so Egypt also understands that Palestinian displacement into Egyptian territory adds to different levels of its own insecurity with regard to kind of refugees and other movements that could happen within Egypt's borders. So just to kind of put that out there, I know that it's noted that Egypt obviously is very much in support of the Palestinian cause and like for promoting a Palestinian state, but it's also understands itself as a state that needs to advance its own national security. But I guess in terms of challenge, but a level of hope in healing the U.S.-Egypt relationship, they both have a vested interest in stopping Houthi attacks in the Red Sea because Suez Canal revenue has declined by 70%. That's huge for the Egyptian economy that, as I mentioned previously, is in dire straits, wanting more funding from the IMF or from France, et cetera. So I'll leave it there in terms of challenges, both like economic and politically, but there's a broader kind of consensus that the social conditions of Egypt are severely impacted by these economic concerns and austerity measures that is putting a severe strain on social and cultural life in Egypt. Where that leads, I don't know. And politically, there's a repositioning and a restructuring of Egypt's role in the region in general.
I'm curious, I mean, since you are interested in migration, do you see a push for moving out of Egypt? Do you find among your relatives, especially, we just have to get out of here, this is a hopeless environment?
I mean, absolutely. I think that's a long-standing concern, but even more so, I think now. I mean, obviously, my work has mainly focused on Christians in the Middle East in general, and so the perception is that Christians are fleeing the Middle East simply because they're Christian, and that is actually, I think, not entirely true. What is true is the fact that Christians, along with like Egyptian Muslims or just Muslims in general in the region, are all under economic constraints, not seeing a future for themselves and their families. And so I think that there is push to migrate because of economic opportunity abroad, even if that means being disconnected from what you've known your entire life and what is home. So yes, I have seen many families over the past few years desire to leave Egypt and try to leave under the current administration, U.S. administration, at least to the U.S. I don't know how possible that is.
You had mentioned to me when we talked about this, you had mentioned to me something about there was geostrategic significance to some of this migration. Do you want to mention what you talked about then?
Yeah. So part of my work for my first book that just came out has focused on the relevance of the green card lottery, the diversity visa program for the Middle East in general, but particularly for Egypt, which has been one of the highest recipients of the green card lottery, meaning that so many Egyptians are applying for it that the number of winners is incredibly large in proportion to the other countries that are a part of the program. That migration, particularly like since 2011, there's been such an increase, which is seen at least in my own work, the number of churches that have, Coptic Orthodox churches in the United States that have exploded since then because of this influx, means that the Coptic diaspora, but other Middle Eastern Christian diasporas in the United States are gaining a lot more power and influence. And what I mean by that is, so for example, in the current Trump administration, the current FDA commissioner, Marty McCary, is Coptic. There are several others within Trump's orbit who are Coptic, as well as from Iraq, Chaldean, et cetera. So this is all to say that these diasporas are they're very much politically active, not just in terms of lobbying, for their kin back in the homeland, but seeing themselves as a part of a particular political persuasion in the United States as well, possibly because of their experiences back in Egypt.
So do you think they try to shape American policy in any kind of substantive way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they try, and I'm specifically referring to Coptic lobbying organizations in DC. I think that they try. I think in the 1990s it was quite successful with certain Coptic figures' influence over the development of the International Religious Freedom Act, which my book talks about a little bit. And I think in general, it's about the connections that they have with local representatives or even senators because of the enormity of their population being in New Jersey or in Michigan or in California. You see different kind of constituencies pop up and advocate for their kin back in the homeland, and that has an impact upon what representatives and what senators push what bills forward in Congress. So, yeah.
So your discussion of the economic conditions, and I guess political conditions as well, in Egypt are pretty bleak. Any reasons for optimism? Anything to grab onto that we can be hopeful about for the Egyptian case?
Yeah, I mean, I have a practical hope, but I think in general, there's always hope in Egypt because Egyptians are incredibly resourceful and incredibly creative. And I don't just mean that, just saying this for the audience here, like today or online. I think that's why the Egyptian Revolution in 2011 was so captivating, because it was in Egypt. It was in what I would still consider, even though others may not, the heart of the region. Not only because of its enormous population of 117 million people, but because of its very humorous people and politically active people. But more specifically, I would say that for the Egyptian government, I think that there's particularly hope, right? I mean, amidst all of these regional issues, I think there is hope for one thing to be reignited, which is making a deal with Ethiopia over the Gerd Dam, which under the first Trump administration, they were pretty close to signing a deal. But under the Biden administration, that was kind of a non-starter. So there is, I think, potential to turn back towards that. I mean, it's dire for the Egyptian government to figure the situation out water-wise. I mean, that's in the coming years, as the Egyptian population grows, its demands on water will also grow. And so there's a whole conversation to be had on thinking about Egypt's role in broader initiatives for combating climate change and things like that.
Oh, wow. Okay, thank you. All right, well, let's move on to the case of Morocco. So Morocco is something of an unknown quantity to many American watchers of the Middle East. We're lucky to have VanderMeulen as our discussant of the Moroccan case. Ian is an anthropologist who spent significant time in Morocco and other North African countries. He explores the intersection of media, sound, and the senses, and he's also studied Islamic thought and practice. So maybe we should begin, Ian, by talking a little bit about Morocco's rather unique political trajectory in the region and how that gave it a rather unusual experience during the Arab Spring. Maybe just some background there.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And I think, part of the reason why, we don't hear as much about Morocco, in American media or our general political discussion, as much as we hear about some other Middle Eastern countries is, partly because of the sort of stability of the regime and sort of general political stability over time. And I think that was certainly one of the things that really surprised some people, that was much talked about, was kind of the stability of the regime, of the monarchy, through the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011, and since then, and in the face of a pretty direct political challenge from the moderate Islamist party in the country, the Party of Justice and Development, or the PJD. I think it's helpful to kind of back up a little bit, because I think part of the explanation for the stability, through the 2011 and beyond, is really that Morocco was kind of on a liberalizing trajectory already, albeit kind of a slow one, and one that was very carefully kind of managed by the existing regime. So if we back up to kind of the early 2000s, the current king, Mohammed VI, had come to power in 1999, and was very eager to kind of set himself up as kind of a very different kind of leader, and a very different, his regime is a very different kind of regime than his father, Hassan II, whose rule, was kind of known as being very kind of draconian. So he very quickly kind of sponsored a number of human rights-oriented kind of projects, one being a reform of the Personal Status Code in 2004, another also known as the Family Code, and there's a current, a further reform that's happening now, which we can talk about a little bit more. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was designed to kind of document and atone for and even compensate for certain abuses that had happened under his father's regime. So I think all of that kind of put his regime in a position that, once the February 20 movement emerged in 2011, this was kind of the name of the local movement that was inspired by the Arab Spring. They were able to, there were some kind of crackdown, sort of targeted, arrest of certain activists and journalists and the like. But they were also largely able to kind of diffuse that mobilization through some further reform measures that still left the regime in place. Most notably, a revision of the Constitution right after 2011, which gave the elected parliament kind of more lawmaking capability, but still left sort of the dynamics of electoral politics, operating according to kind of palace rules. And so, the last thing I'll sort of say about that is that, that opened the door for some of the PJD's success. They'd been kind of building their social base throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and were in a great position to win elections in 2011 and again in 2015, and basically headed the parliament for roughly a decade. But at the same time, the limits on continued limits on parliamentary governance really meant that they were kind of unable to fulfill some of the campaign promises. And I think that has a lot to do with, explaining why they lost elections in 2021. There were, kind of a lot of proposed economic changes that they had put on the table that they were really kind of hampered from doing. So, before 2011 and since, it's really, the domestic political scene has really been one of sort of gradual liberalization, but still largely according to palace rules.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on what are the limits on the parliamentary powers? I mean, why are they constrained?
Well, there's, I think the economic sphere is one that's particularly, and this was a challenge for the PJD, because I think a lot of their campaign promises were kind of tied to, on the one hand, sort of cracking down on internal kind of government corruption, and there were certain rules that they were able to kind of get past to curtail that a little bit, but larger sort of economic structural changes to really make a difference in people's everyday lives, they really had less power to affect that. There were kind of existing, loans coming in from the IMF that that required certain austerity measures that couldn't really be rolled back. We can address the regional kind of situation, but also, it was during the PJD rule that Morocco signed on to the Abraham Accords, which kind of undermined the party's sort of ideological support for the Palestinian cause a little bit. But really, I think, the groundwork for that deal had been laid long ago. So it wasn't really something that the PJD could quibble with, yeah.
We often see the Moroccan political system as more responsive than other political systems in the region. I mean, it's all relative, of course. But maybe you can just say something about how that played out with regard to the reform of the family code, which is really something quite extraordinary in Morocco.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is something that I addressed in a recent Crown Center Middle East brief published about a year ago. This new reformed code actually has not been approved or even finalized yet. So this gives you some sense of sort of what a drawn-out process this has been. I mean, to give a little bit of historical context, on 2004 as well, and sort of before, Morocco, almost since independence, had a personal status code that was largely kind of a codified version of certain principles of Sunni Islamic law, according to the Maliki school, but regarded as so there'd been kind of a reform even with independence, but was regarded as very conservative even compared to Morocco's North African neighbors, which also had Maliki-based personal status codes. So the 2004 reform, which I mentioned in my earlier comments, was a response to kind of growing sort of grassroots pressure from women's rights activism domestically sort of throughout the 1980s and 1990s, as well as certain new international principles, emergence of CEDAW, and very much that first reform kind of very much a top-down process. It was basically the king kind of instructing the government's ulama, or the sort of official Islamic scholars, to revise the code, to make it more equitable for women on the one hand, but keep it within sort of Maliki principles on the other. There were some pretty profound changes, at least in sort of the letter of the law. They raised the official marriage age to 18, with some possible exceptions that individual judges could grant. That becomes a problem kind of later. I think the biggest change was granting women equal access to divorce and new rights with regard to things like alimony, child support payments. So initially it was kind of hailed as this big step forward, but over time I think growing dissatisfaction with some people kind of arguing that reform just hadn't kind of gone far enough in the letter of the law, but I think more so a lot of criticism that it was too ambiguous, and that this resulted in a lot of problems in terms of implementation. So the kind of still ongoing reform process, which started in October 2023, has been more, it was initiated by the king, but has been a lot more kind of participatory, a lot more public. It's involved hundreds of sort of town hall style listening sessions, input from civil society groups, official political parties, NGOs. One of the things that's kind of been interesting though is that the PJD was always, their kind of fall from power was sort of seen as the opening for this reform. And they've been kind of portrayed as sort of against any reforms all along. But one of the things I tried to sort of underscore in the brief is that if you actually look at how they've participated in these discussions and the kind of the details of some of their proposed amendments, they're actually targeting some of the kind of problems in implementation, some of the so-called loopholes, and in general not as kind of opposed to women's rights reform as they're made out to be, or as any Islamist party is often made out to be. And in fact, it was actually in the latest sort of phase, from let's say January of this year, it was actually the state ulama corps who kind of held up the draft code for a number of months and ultimately nixed some of its more controversial kind of proposals. So now it's been sort of kicked back to a further phase of like civil society negotiation.
But I think what's most fascinating about that is the high degree of public engagement in the process, which is quite extraordinary for the region. Does that make you somewhat optimistic about the regime being responsive and engaged with public interests, a public organization, or what do you think?
I would say I'm maybe more optimistic in the long term than in the short term. I mean, I think one of the things, about this sort of dynamic, or this, as I called it in the brief, this sort of opposition effect, this sort of state, discourse or media kind of turning the PJD into this, opposed figure, this, figure that's opposed to reforms, is that it really kind of underscores the regime's own power over the process, even to the extent that it's sort of managing from the sidelines. On the other hand, I do think, and I think at the same time too, there's been, there were ways in which the monarchy kind of managed from the sidelines during the PJD's period in parliamentary power that really undermined its rule. Particularly, I mean, there were new parties that were emerging that had like personal connections to the palace, that pretty much, I mean, in a parliamentary system where you have to build coalitions, right, it kind of undermined the PJD's ability to build a truly kind of oppositional kind of governing coalition. But at the same time, I think that has sort of made the palace's meddling in electoral politics more visible to the general population. So I think it's made people a little bit more kind of politically aware. I think on the issue of women's rights generally, there's kind of important emerging scholarship that has suggested that even in sort of more socially conservative communities, even in rural communities where it was thought that it was very difficult to implement family code reform, that actually social attitudes toward women's rights reform in general are pretty favorable, like more favorable than we would assume. So I think these are, this creates some of the conditions for possibly, more fundamental change, but maybe on a longer kind of time scale.
That's really fascinating. So let me ask you one last question, and that is, what do you think are the most important challenges that Morocco faces on the regional level?
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking mostly about domestic politics. I mean, I guess two big challenges and a couple, opportunities that I would highlight. One of the biggest challenges, I think, is the ongoing conflict in the Western Sahara. This is I mean, I could talk all day about this, actually, even though I'm not, an expert on the conflict. Basically, this goes back to sort of the period of colonization, or decolonization, I should say, when Spain kind of hung on to the period south of the French zone after Moroccan independence in 1956, even as a sort of independent Sahrawi, like, independence movement was emerging. Morocco tried to annex the territory, or did occupy the territory in 1975, and this kind of led to a series of kind of on-again, off-again military engagements that left tens of thousands of people displaced sort of throughout the region, sort of sub-region. And it's kind of ground to a little bit of a stalemate at the moment, although there continues to be kind of military buildup in some of the border and buffer zones. And the first Trump administration, when they got Morocco to sign on to the Abraham Accords, the big concession that they gave, going against decades of U.S. foreign policy and most of the international community, was to actually recognize Morocco's claim to the Western Sahara. It's hard to see, I think, at this point, like, where it's gonna go from here. I think immigration is also a big a big issue. Spain and France have long sort of put pressure on Morocco to be kind of a buffer, particularly with regard to African migration to Europe. And so domestic policy has largely been, tried to incentivize settlement. This does put a lot of strain on on the economy. So that's, these are kind of things to watch. But I do think, Morocco, if it wanted to, is well positioned to kind of play a diplomatic role with regard to Middle East peace. I mean, given its signing on to the Abraham Accords, I think, this was actually a long time coming in some ways. We forget that as late as 1960, Morocco had a native Jewish population of 500,000. There's been recently a lot of even government-sponsored kind of effort to revitalize and recuperate and remember that Jewish heritage, partly to kind of tap into an emerging Israeli tourism market. Morocco is very reliant on tourism in its economy. But I think that, puts it in a good position. Whether there's political will to play a role, it's hard to answer that kind of question. The last thing I'll say is just that Morocco is really, and this is not just regional, but potentially global. They've really been trying to position themselves as a regional and global leader in green energy production. So solar farms, distribution infrastructure, there's been kind of major investment in these areas. There have been, some political difficulties. I think some important emerging scholarship that has touched on, even though a lot of these mega projects are kind of in sparsely populated areas, they have kind of displaced some people, created some adverse living conditions for locals. But there's been a lot of investment, a lot of construction, and the people that are kind of directly involved in this are really optimistic that this can not just offset Morocco's reliance on fossil fuels, but Europe's reliance on fossil fuels as well. So definitely something to watch, and I guess going back to notes of optimism, like something to watch with optimistic mind.
Thank you. Okay, let's now turn to the case of Tunisia, which is best known today as the country that initiated and modeled the popular protests that set off the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011, and it's also known as the sole Arab country that successfully sustained transition to democracy after the Arab Spring, until it didn't, when Kais Saied began his self-coup in July of 2021. At this point, let's just start by focusing on a somewhat tangential issue, but I think one that's really fascinating. I think one of the most distinctive aspects of Tunisia's experiment with democratization is the cultural innovations that it spearheaded, most notably the reconciliation of democracy and Islam. And that was carried out under the inspiration of one of the most innovative Islamists, Rashid Ghannouchi. And providentially, we have one of the premier experts on this question to interrogate. Andrew March is a political theorist who has worked extensively on the intersection of political philosophy, Islamic law, religion, and political theory. His first book, Islam and Liberal Citizenship, expressly focuses on the question of the overlapping consensus, finding an overlapping consensus between Islamic and liberal values. And his second book focuses on the invention of popular sovereignty in modern Islamic thought. And Andrew has spent significant time in Tunisia and has engaged in extensive conversation with Rashid Ghannouchi, who unfortunately is still in prison. But maybe you can just tell us a little bit about, first, the challenges of reconciling these dual commitments and how Tunisia's Islamist thinker, how Ghannouchi, proposed the reconciliation of the two.
Right. Thank you very much for that question. I actually spent my Crown Fellowship year finishing a book that I put together with Ghannouchi called On Muslim Democracy, Essays and Dialogues. And it was precisely about this idea that many Islamist or former Islamist parties have a habit of referring to themselves as Muslim Democrats as opposed to Islamists, partly as a way of signaling a kind of affinity with the tradition of Christian democracy in Europe. This should be legible to you. There's a tradition of parties claiming a kind of cultural or religious conservatism, yet being fully committed to democracy. So partly a way of, I think, signaling to domestic and international skeptics a certain kind of commitment to a pluralist political system as opposed to an ultimate desire to take over the state. But I think also to signify a very, very real ideological and political transition from a kind of traditional 20th century idea that there is a coherent and clear Islamic alternative to the modern secular or sovereign state, that Islamic law contains the answers and solutions to everything, a kind of utopian ideology to a more pragmatic ideology that is not dogmatically secular, but is also not dogmatically anti-secular. So there was a lot sort of involved in Ghanouchi's reflections on the transition of his own ideological commitments that he expressed throughout the 80s and 90s to practice and discourse since the Tunisian Revolution of 2011. So in terms of this question of, how do we think about the way in which this embrace of democracy at the religious and cultural and ideological level developed or was expressed, it's sort of conventional to think about this in terms of three strands. One is the sort of tradition of modern Islamist discourse, let's say since the 1920s or 30s. So a tradition that was inaugurated by figures like Maududi or Qutb in terms of theorizing a distinct regime type, distinct Islamic state, commitments to things like the sovereignty of God, the supremacy and sufficiency of the Islamic Sharia, but also certain kinds of concepts that signal the essential modern nature of this ideology, the idea that the people at large is God's caliph on earth, so a kind of popularization of the idea of an Islamic state, very little reference to traditional models of kingship or a division of authority between the scholars and an executive. So there's that tradition in which Ghanouchi, as a philosopher and an intellectual, particularly in this book, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, is contributing to and extending and transforming a 100-year discourse around what exactly is an Islamic state, to what extent is it democratic, what are its institutions, what are its commitments to different kinds of rights or freedoms, who's allowed to participate, who's allowed to be elected to a representative assembly, what are the powers of the elected assembly over other kinds of authorities, and what is the place and role of an Islamic people in guaranteeing democracy and preventing tyranny. So at one level, that is kind of Ghanouchi's sort of transnational significance. So since he's been in jail for 2 years, almost exactly, I've had the opportunity to present this book in Malaysia and Morocco most recently, Bosnia, Turkey, and so his reputation sort of precedes him everywhere in the Islamic world, from Morocco to Malaysia. So that's a significant contribution. He will be part of the canon of modern Islamic thought for many, many decades. The second, I think, big trend is a real or perceived, and what's the difference between something being real or perceived if the perception carries weight, of what's sometimes called a Tunisian particularity, al-khususiyya Tunisiyya, where it sort of suggested that since the 1850s or 60s, when Tunisia had the first ever written constitution for a Muslim country, a tradition of reformist discourse on the part of Tunisian Islamic scholars, that there is a distinct kind of Tunisian path towards, reformism, moderation, pluralism, a flexibility with regards to Islamic law. So there's a kind of ready-made sense that this is not alien to us. We, quote-unquote, moderate Islamists are not alien. We're not, simply inventing this since, the Arab Spring or something like that. But we don't only situate our own thinking in terms of traditional Islamic law or the broader sort of Ikhwani Islamist discourse, right? So we don't only see ourselves as part of that tradition, we also see ourselves as a kind of organic movement that is indebted to this Tunisian tradition. And then the third strand, I think, is a very, very historically specific one of the Tunisian democratic opposition since the 1970s and 80s. So there's been a lot of rivalry between the Islamists of the Islamic tendency movement, which became the Ennahda party, and leftist groups, communists, trade unions, but also a lot of sort of interborrowing. Ennahda kind of turns to a discourse of social justice in the 1970s and 80s in response to labor activism, bread riots, things like this. So whatever their ideology or discourse at a very, very high level was, they always saw themselves as part of a broader Tunisian opposition to authoritarianism. So the initial sort of manifesto or document, the founding document of the Islamic tendency movement, openly sort of welcomes democratic participation with communists and with trade unionists and others who might traditionally be regarded as beyond the pale of legitimate pluralism in an Islamic society. So there's that. And now this occurs, of course, inside and outside Tunisia. So lots of people have written about, when we try to explain why is Tunisian democracy successful until it wasn't, as you said, one of the main factors that people point to is the 20 or 30 year conversations and dialogues and relationships between different kinds of Tunisian Democrats in exile, in France, in the United Kingdom, human rights groups, feminist groups, social democratic groups, and the Islamists. They formulated different kinds of declarations in 2005. And so lots of people have said that, when the transition happened in 2011, these people knew each other. There were long-standing relationships. There were relationships of trust to a certain extent that were strained, in the face of real politics. But they weren't strangers to one another. And in a way, this may anticipate something else that you want to talk about, but in a way, I think it's possible to speculate on whether the elite trust and ties ran a lot deeper and perhaps ran ahead a little bit of the corresponding sentiments and ties in society itself.
So that's really interesting, this Tunisia's past experience with constitutionalism, its moderation, and the long-term collaboration between Islamists and secular progressives is really something that distinguishes Tunisia from other cases and explains some of its success, initial success. So why did it fail?
So why did it fail? So, there's a funny way in which, as social scientists, we want everything to be kind of determined. We want there to be some deep causality. And, if the Tunisian case was different from Egypt, we want this to be structural and there to be like deep reasons for this in which this was inevitable. And, that's not always the case. Sometimes they're just accidents, right? If certain presidents had had a better family life, had been loved by their parents more, had a different psychology, could we just get on with like ordinary oligarchy and ordinary corruption as opposed to pathological commitments to undoing everything? So of course I'm talking about Qais Said and things like this. So there are some like structural factors that are very common to talk about. So the Tunisian military was, to put it in the technical political science term, just generally historically less Egyptian-y than the Egyptian one. Had less of a history of of regarding itself as the true sovereign. So, with the comparison with Morocco, there are some states in which there's a kind of, filled center of sovereignty, the Moroccan king or the Mekhzen, the Egyptian military. Tunisia, when the regime collapsed, it wasn't that the state went away. The state continued, and that was hugely important, but there's a kind of empty, symbolic sovereignty there, right? The military didn't regard itself as the guardian of the state to the same extent. So there was a place for the parties to kind of bootstrap their way into a new regime. Second, I think you do have some demographic factors. So, as we all know, in the Egyptian Constituent Assembly, the combined Islamist representation between the Brotherhood and the Salafis was about 70%. In Tunisia, Ennahda had in the Constituent Assembly about 41%. There was this, tendency of love, tahir al-mahabba, that had an additional percentage. So some people like to say that there was a 50 or 51% Islamist majority, but I don't really put a lot of stock in that. So you had a lot more balance. You had a lot more of a sense that there was no default majority, and thus, on the part of those that were secular or skeptics, that there was a sense that politics could be an answer to this, that you didn't need to turn to a revolution or a coup in order to prevent yourself from becoming a perpetual minority. But then the third factor, and this is one of these things that doesn't necessarily have an over-determined cause, but elite bargaining. And so, the old regime in the 2013-14 elections ran a terrible anti-Islamist, populist, demagogic campaign showing videos from the Syrian civil war, an avowedly anti-Ghannouchi, anti-Ennahda campaign. And then they got together in Paris and made a deal. And so my last conversation with Ghannouchi before he was arrested was December 21, January 2022. And what's very interesting, because as a political theorist, one of the things that's fascinating about his earlier work and his commitment to democracy in terms of a comparative democratic theory perspective is the extent to which he places an emphasis on popular control over the political system. So, when you think about why do democracies succeed or fail, and, there's one tendency that, runs from Montesquieu and Madison to the present. It's all about institutions. It's all about checks and balances. But Ghannouchi, he talks about Madison and Montesquieu and says, no, for us, the fundamental guarantor against tyranny is the people. They will be pious, they will be Muslim, they would never allow someone to hijack and monopolize the Sharia. They are the ultimate representation of both Islam and democracy, so on and so forth. Now, in 2021, I said, well, why did it work so long? What is the secret? And he just says, very simply, agreement of the elites. That's what makes it work. And so you can see why he would think this. There were lots of possibilities for a coup to happen earlier. The crisis year of 2013, the assassinations, the coup in Egypt. Many people would have supported this. And yet, his personal relationship with Beji and just the decision on the part of that party to choose politics over anti-politics and over a coup lasted for the rest of Beji's lifetime, who I like to refer in a way that unfortunately no undergraduate students can get anymore, the F.W. de Klerk of Tunisia, right? So the representative of the old regime that just made a decision to try politics with the traditional opposition. So, and I think about this a lot because, checks and balances, constitutions are only as good as the elite's interest in maintaining them, the elite's interest in checking their own power, and not pursuing every advantage that they can. So it doesn't have to get to the point in which you require some kind of as David Brooks is now calling for, a general, societal uprising or something to that effect. So I think that's a really, I think it's a very interesting coda to his, intellectual trajectory, going from a very, very strong populist democratic vision to one in which, in conditions of radical pluralism and mistrust, at some point you have to rely on the elites not taking the soonest possible advantage to blow up the system.
Okay, so looking generalizably, does that make you optimistic about the future of other countries in the region? If we're going to rely on elites so much, are there lessons that these other countries might learn that make us optimistic?
Well, I think Ian's talked a lot about Morocco and some of the grounds to be optimistic there. And, you have, I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which, Morocco has democratized, but you have, I think, the closest example to an alternative vision that a lot of people, including political scientists, have sort of hoped for, right? Gradual democratization under the sort of guidance of an enlightened monarch, keeping the system together step by step, pulling back, allowing things to happen, but without a radical break, without a revolution, and all of the energies that unleashes. So I was just in Morocco in March, at Iftar with Ben Kiren, and Ghannouchi remains very, very popular there, very influential, and I think this sort of ideological template for Islamists for, thinking about how we're merely participating in politics. The state is not entirely defined in terms of this identity. It's not necessarily on a trajectory towards the realization of a utopian Islamic state, but in which, instead of seeing politics through a theological lens as the application of certain conceptions of truth, that you begin with certain facts about politics, that politics is necessarily a sphere of pluralism, it's a sphere of disagreement. It's not always this, this sort of ideal sense that the people is always religious. It's only because of colonialism. It's only because of violent secularism that the people is not getting what it wants, but rather this recognition that the people itself is conflicted, it's diverse. Not everybody, once they have the boot off their neck, is going to share the same views or values. So this beginning with the idea that politics is the primary fact of life and not theology, and that politics is characterized by disagreement, by pluralism, and that there's a choice, that you draw the line of friends and enemies not on a theological basis. Your friends are Muslims and your enemies are those who are enemies of Islam, but around the conception of democracy. So this is the main sort of shift, not the main, but one thing that comes out very clearly in Ghannouchi's thought, which is that, we're creating democracy is a very tenuous, very delicate process. And it doesn't come magically, it's not guaranteed by institutions. And so your friends are those, whatever their other ideological orientation is, who are committed to that as a condition for all other politics. And your enemies, whether secular or Islamist, are those that are enemies of this kind of construction of a democratic sort of field of operation. So, I think a kind of like ideological and religious template is there, but the structural conditions are what matter. You need, some sort of balance of power, right? Look what you have in Syria right now. You have, one party has monopolized all power, no incentive to consider other kinds of democratic arrangements. So you need certain kinds of conditions. And the countries in which those conditions obtain, I think, are pretty clear. Possibly Morocco, I'm not sure which else. Maybe Jordan until yesterday.
And yet, before you were saying elite commitment is so important to the success of this process. And if we look at the elites in countries like Egypt or Tunisia, we don't see elites committed to continuing that process. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on. And we have until 10:45, do we not? Oh, I apologize. I thought we had till 10:45. Where did I, okay, sorry about that. Okay, misjudgment there. All right, well, let's turn our attention away from these specific countries, my apologies, and we will now turn to some general challenges that affect North Africa and the region as a whole. And we're very lucky to have Jeannie Sowers, who is an expert on the effects of protracted conflict in the region and environmental challenges that the region faces. She is the author, most recently, of the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Environmental Politics. She's conducted extensive research fieldwork in Egypt over the years, has written extensively on Egypt as well. So, Jeannie, perhaps you can start us off by discussing the problem of protracted conflict in the region and what has been the most important consequence of this phenomenon.
Sure. So, can you hear me? Yeah, there we go. I think when we think of protracted conflict, of course, we think of long duration wars, and that's, of course, been an interminable feature of the human condition. But there are several distinctive features that we have seen play out in places like Yemen, Syria, the Palestinian territories, and Libya that are distinctive and merit sort of considerations of their commonalities. And one of the organizations that's been articulating this is the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent and Red Cross affiliates across the world who work in these areas. And it's worth remembering that most humanitarian assistance now is concentrated in places where conflict has gone on for decades. So the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, 2/3 of its work is in areas of protracted conflict. Most of those areas in the Middle East and North Africa are concentrated in places like Lebanon, Gaza and the West Bank, Jordan, Sudan, South Sudan, Iraq. And for all of these places, they have been involved now for decades. So the problem of protracted conflict is that we have these distinctive features, and I just want to briefly elucidate some of them. So one of them, as many of my colleagues who work on these particular countries will know, is the proliferation, of course, of not just state actors and militias affiliated with states or non-state actors, but actually hybrid actors that embody both of these and link to them in very interesting and particular ways. And so we have hybrid actors, and we have connections to, of course, regional powers and great powers. These actors and their alliances are very mutable. So they change their names, they change their alliances, they actually change their strategic and ideological frameworks and goals quite rapidly. And this makes processes of accountability for things like human rights abuses or the destruction of objects essential to civilian life very challenging in terms of attributing who does what and why. We also see the renewed use of aerial warfare in an extent in which we have not really seen since World War II. And this both takes traditional forms of dropping large-scale bombs and new forms, right, of the constant surveillance of drones or using drones for assassinated and targeted assassinations or simply using supposed targeted munitions that can destroy entire residential buildings. We also see, of course, and we talked about this yesterday, new forms of surveillance and the use of AI and algorithms that are extremely troublesome and that are disproportionately producing civilian casualties, even though they're supposedly targeting, say, a single leading actor in a non-state militia. Along with this fragmentation of actors, we also see fragmentations of territorial control, which also, and the carving of spheres of influence within these countries. So our panel today really focused on states that still have coherence and still have territorial control. But then there's whole swaths of the region in which that's not the case. So for Syria, of course, both Turkey and Israel are busy carving out spheres of influence that are not seen by those actors as short-term, as one example. Same in Yemen with the role of the United Arab Emirates and the role of Saudi Arabia, and of course the role of Ansar Allah. So the next sort of distinctive feature I just want to highlight is the urbanization of this type of warfare. So the devastation that we've seen in terms of human lives and particularly civilian casualties is partly because of the conflicts playing out in highly contested urban areas. These don't represent countries as a whole necessarily, but certainly the sort of notions that we hear in scholarship of domicide and herbicide try to capture this real devastation of sort of central cities and their sort of cultural and religious and social importance in a way that has very long-term effects. My work at the Crown Center, and actually for the past few years, really focused on one element of this modern element of warfare, which is the displacement, undermining of civilian infrastructures and its attendant physical and mental and health consequences. So one of the features of protracted conflicts is the long-term cumulative interactive effects on undermining the basic provision of services. So water, energy, sanitation, food security, healthcare, education. These are the long-term consequences that we're facing because of protracted conflicts. And this is a much more pessimistic view of the challenges facing the region because these places are not providing these services, and the prospect that they can do so or rebuild or reconstruct in any short time frame seems to me actually not possible. And I would say the most discouraging thing for me personally, watching the last few months, is the devastation wreaked on the humanitarian sector and environmental protection, not only because the US, of course, has devastated and basically withdrawn foreign assistance and its ability to interact with local communities and NGOs, which there have been, of course, decades of experience, but also the US is basically withdrawing from its key allies, such as Ukraine, so that European countries, which have long given substantial development assistance and humanitarian aid, now those countries have also retracted their foreign aid budgets so that they can focus on defense. So the reorientation of everyone to their defense needs has devastated the humanitarian sector. I was in a webinar last week with mostly almost all the organizations that work at the intersection of conflict, environment, and humanitarian assistance, and most of those people were either facing unemployment now or facing cutoff to their funding, which meant they might be unemployed in a few months. So the most important consequence is this cumulative degradation and undermining of human well-being and welfare. And that also has links to the environment. So what makes places habitable for people is the provision of these basic services. And when these services collapse, that doesn't just have human impacts, but it has impacts on the environment. So when a water treatment system plant goes off or a sewage treatment plant goes offline, you then have contamination of water, contamination of underground aquifers, contamination of arable land. When you have conflict, as we've seen, you have some irreversible effects on the environment. I think one of the most well-known examples is the oil lakes that are now basically tar mats across Kuwait from the Gulf War. But there's also damage from tanks going over arid landscapes where the land is then compacted and actually cannot be easily made re-arable again. So I think the most important consequences are these human environment coupled impacts that are cumulative, that are degrading, and that really undermine long-term prospects for families and communities.
So do you think, though, that the Middle East is, environmentally speaking, much worse off than other portions of the world, or is this just a general problem in, let's say, less developed countries?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about these conflicts is they've been in formerly middle-income countries as well, right? So Syria was the best example of that. So I don't think the Middle East is inherently more environmentally problematic. I think as political scientists or economists, we would say that it's the political economic institutions and the incentives in them that deter elites from actually addressing environmental problems. But that being said, we certainly see the impacts of particularly climate change, but climate change interacting with the loss of biodiversity, with interacting with pollution, in ways that absolutely directly threaten sort of human security and human well-being. So for those of you who track dust storms, the dust storms in Iraq and Kuwait over in April created hazardous health conditions, sent 4,000 people to the ER, and actually made it impossible to have school or go to work. And those dust storms are intensifying. It's NOAA, our own agency, does that kind of work, and they show that dust storms both increase in frequency and intensity as climate change intensifies. So I think that's one example, a concrete example, of how vulnerability to climate change is being impacted by not only intensifying global environmental challenges, but what makes people vulnerable to those is this undermining of basic services and the things that make life habitable.
Okay, so this is pretty depressing, but any reasons to be optimistic? Any glimmers of hope in the region in this regard?
Yeah, so Eva asked me this last week, and I was like, well, I don't know. But I want to echo Candace's point, actually, when she talked about resourcefulness. I started my career studying Egypt, and I fully agree with her about the resourcefulness of Egyptians. But I think you see that in all of these conflict zones. for those of you who follow social media accounts of sort of people repurposing materials out of rubble in Gaza, or you see people basically planting wild and edible plants outside displaced persons' tents, like right away, you see a form of resilience that I think we should never underestimate. So that's my long-term source of hope. I think more sort of concretely and practically, the experience of so many internally displaced persons who are living in both semi-informal areas, urban areas, and now in sort of places that they really shouldn't be living, means that we see a lot of adaptation at very local levels. And that happens between local NGOs, communities, but also international aid organizations. So we see things like innovative and decentralized small-scale provision of water and energy, whether these are small-scale desalination plants, solar arrays. But all of that provision of basic services in this kind of unconventional, innovative way is still dependent upon the political conditions. So to just give you a concrete example, a colleague and I facilitated a grant to an Israeli-Palestinian NGO called EcoPeace, which has offices in Amman and Ramallah and Tel Aviv. And the grant was to fund an UNRWA school that would have a small desalination plant, a solar array to generate electricity, a rainwater cistern to hold water both from rainfall but also gray water recycling. So it essentially made the school entirely self-sufficient because of the conditions of the cutoff of, this was before, of course, October 2023. But that school, we don't even know if it exists anymore. So all of this provision of assistance to create self-sufficient, sustainable systems still depends upon, of course, a broader context. And you see the same thing with the provision of solar PV at local levels in the West Bank in Area C, where they're actually vulnerable very routinely to settler violence and settler attacks. So I think we have seen innovative ways to deal with protracted conflict, but without political settlements and, of course, state capacity, these things are so vulnerable to disruption.
Great. So do we have time now for questions? Okay. We have 10 minutes. Okay. So let's first turn to the audience. We have one or two questions from the audience, the electronic audience, but people in the room. Yes, please. Oh, wait.
Education City in Qatar is a very interesting place from my perspective. It's sort of multinational, multi-religious. It's also well-moneyed, and there's a lot of oil behind it. But I'm wondering what kind of effect it has more globally outside of, outside of Education City, outside of Qatar. Does that sort of concept bleed over into any of the other countries that we've been talking about?
Egypt and North Africa? I mean, perhaps that's a question we should address when we get to our Gulf panel, and people on the Gulf will have better understanding of that issue. Shall we just postpone that question? It's an interesting one. Yes, for sure. Yes.
Not intentional at all, but somewhat related to this. The Emirates and Saudi have had an outsized influence in terms of shaping understandings of foreign policy in Tunisia and Egypt, I would say, and I don't know the extent in Morocco. Could any of you speak to how the sort of regional framework and the efforts of regional powers is shaping, or not shaping, the attitudes of people in North Africa? I feel like Egypt has been a particular target of the Emirates and Saudi, and I feel like Tunisia has been, at least up until Qais Said came into power. So I don't know if any of you all could speak to that. It's somewhat related, but slightly different.
Yeah, I'll just say a quick comment to say that obviously, Egypt needs funding and money. And so both Saudi and the UAE have been, particularly the Emirates in recent years, but I mean also Saudi, funding particular like construction projects. I mean, essentially like buying up Egyptian land too. So that's like another factor to think about Egypt's territorial sovereignty vis-a-vis kind of Gulf investments and influence. But one thing I wanted to bring up in general, because there's, and maybe others on the panel can address this too, is Sudan. And I think contestations over this UAE investment in Egypt vis-a-vis the Emirates funding of militias in Sudan that has led to the forced expulsion of more and more Sudanese into Egypt, that has also furthered a internal national security crisis. The fact that Egypt, houses, I think the most refugees in the entire continent of Africa. And so my earlier comments about Palestinian refugees being in Egypt is compounded by the fact that there are so many Sudanese refugees there. And so I'm bringing that up only because there's a tension, particularly when it comes to the Emirates, both having investment, financial interest, and concerns in the Egyptian context, but also being at, I think, foreign policy odds with the Egyptian state. So how does that work itself out? I don't know, but if there's other, insights on Sudan, since Sudan is not represented today, I think that it would be a good opportunity to kind of bring that up if there are others too.
I can just say one thing briefly about Gulf investment inland in Sudan. So that has been a very good example of mega projects that were, of course, not done usually with the consent of communities. There were not environmental impact assessments, of course, and that was before the most recent round of the Civil War. And of course, the UAE is actually the primary financier of the Rapid Support Forces.
I mean, I guess I could say one quick thing, just because it's sort of in my, more direct kind of scholarly wheelhouse, which is, with regard to kind of state-sponsored religious trends in Morocco. There's been a lot of sort of investment in teaching Maliki law and ethics, in Quranic recitation, according to sort of Moroccan styles, and this is all very much within a kind of oppositional framing vis-a-vis sort of religious trends coming from the Gulf. And that has, that has in some ways sort of allowed the regime to position itself as sort of a sponsor of this kind of, localized religious revitalization, sort of against sort of what are perceived as more conservative trends in the Gulf, and now to kind of export that somewhat to other places in West Africa. Morocco is, I think, the way in which those two trends relate to each other. There's a cultural dimension to the way in which, a religious and cultural dimension to the way in which Morocco is kind of positioning itself as a regional player, sort of in opposition to into the Gulf.
My name is Dick Lockwood. I've been teaching food security for 20 years at the Heller School, and this comment has to do with Morocco. So the conflict in the Western Sahara is very important for multinational pharmaceutical companies, because the phosphorus that we consume in Centrum vitamins comes from the Western Sahara. The richest phosphate minerals in the whole world are in Morocco. And the multinationals export or import the rock phosphates from the Western Sahara to Louisiana, where it undergoes chemical processes. And the phosphorus that we consume over the counter in CVS comes from the Western Sahara. So I'd be curious as to your comment on the Western Sahara and the vested interest that these pharmaceutical companies have for stability.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can't speak to pharmaceuticals specifically, but I would add to what you're saying that it's also, I mean, phosphates are incredibly important for the batteries that power our phones, our computers, increasingly our cars. So there's a real global dimension to this, certainly. As far as sort of stability or a resolution to the conflict, I mean, as I said before, it's kind of ground to this, like, not quite sort of mini Cold War, but sort of stalemate with continued military buildup. So I think it's a very sort of, tense, volatile situation. And I think, with the U.S. having already recognized Moroccan sovereignty, I think that was a big concession that was probably unnecessary, actually, with regard to the Abraham Accords. And it basically puts, the U.S. can't exert any sort of pressure on the situation anymore. That's going to have to come from elsewhere, probably Europe. France will probably get involved at some point. But it's also a situation where some of those regional players are already compromised. The Polisario movement, which is the kind of military arm of the Sahrawi independence movement, is basically seen as a puppet of Spanish and Algerian funding. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a great answer to it, but it's certainly something that's important to watch, and somebody besides the U.S. is going to have to kind of step into the diplomatic arena.
Thank you, everyone. That was really interesting. My question is for Jeannie, though. So as an historian, I'm always interested in the situation that we're in today. How much of it is a continuity? How much of it is a break from the past? And when you were speaking, I was thinking about the 1980s, when you have the Iran-Iraq War, which is the longest conventional warfare of the 20th century. You have the Lebanese Civil War, you have the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, you have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Right at the heel of the Iran-Iraq War, you have the first Gulf War. So when you were talking about protracted wars and the environmental and health consequences today, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit, if it's relevant, in terms of how singular the moment we are in today, because to find solutions, I think we have to understand how is this different from a previous moment in which you had these long protracted wars, right?
That's a great question. So exactly by protracted, those are the conflicts I'm referring to. So although we've talking about post-2011 as well, particularly for places like Iraq or the Arab-Israeli conflict, that's exactly right. Those are the trajectories. So the places I would look for answers, I don't have those answers specifically, but the places I've looked to for myself are studies in environmental history, in particular, that try to link sort of human adaptation and changes in the environment, and also anthropological studies of political ecology, which I find fascinating. I think there's a lot of great work actually being done in Iraq now, both by field workers, some of them actually from the Crown Center, but also from scholars from Iraq that try to link these forms of environmental degradation through these different types of wars. And this is when what we really lack in a way is baseline information, right? So it's very hard for us to say, how much arable land has been affected, or what have crop, sort of variability been changes over time. When I used to work on Egypt, we don't even know how much water Egypt actually consumes. This is a national security secret. You can spend months and months and months trying to get into the Ministry of Irrigation to get in, when you finally get in, to find out that their documentation is not there. They don't hold it, none of it's publicly accessible, and it's all held in national security agencies. So across the region, we also have this problem that we think environmental issues are not political, but they are highly politicized. And as soon as it comes to natural resources of any kind, but particularly now water, I think one of the panelists yesterday mentioned shortages of water in Iraq. That's absolutely been a long-term problem related to the conflicts, because the ways that you would sustainably provide and extract things like water or process it have been undermined for decades. And we see this when we think about protracted conflicts. What we see is that the ability to maintain basically centralized systems or large-scale systems, it's not simply destruction of the physical infrastructure. It's the brain drain. It's the fact that talented people have gone and are never going to come back. It's the problem that there is no funding for it, right? So these things are the first things to fall off. And humanitarian organizations, both local and international, have been increasingly devoting their budgets to simply maintaining municipal and national electricity grids, water facilities, water installations, but they cannot replace states. And so I guess what I would say is that we need to think long-term to understand the ways in which those systems have degraded. Because it's not that they're simply destroyed, it's that their functioning has been undermined, as you just suggested, over very long periods of time.
Well, I have to apologize to the people online who submitted questions. I misjudged the timing of this panel, so I will pass on the questions to the panelists, and maybe we can continue online a conversation. But thank you very much to the panelists for their comments, and thank you to the audience for participating.